In 1947, when India took its first breath as a free nation, $1 cost exactly 3 rupees and 30 paise. Today, that same dollar costs more than 90 rupees. That is not a number, that is a story 78 years long. A story of wars, droughts, oil shocks, political failures, global conspiracies, structural weakness, and one question that every Indian economist, every policymaker, and every ordinary citizen must confront. Why? Why has the rupee, the currency of the world's largest democracy, the world's fifth largest economy, a nation of 1.4 billion people, lost 96% of its value against the US dollar since independence? This is not a question of pride, this is a question of survival, because every rupee that falls means more expensive oil. India imports 85% of its crude oil. More expensive education abroad, more expensive medicines, more expensive debt. India's foreign debt stands at $682 billion, and less purchasing power for every Indian family on the planet. In this documentary, we do not deal in euphemisms, we deal in facts. Hard, uncomfortable, verified facts. Welcome to the most important financial story of independent India, the fall of the rupee. 19 years after independence, India's government walked into a room with the World Bank and the IMF and came out having agreed to devalue its own currency by 57%. Not gradually, not voluntarily, 57% in one announcement. The reasons? India had just fought two wars, against China in 1962, against Pakistan in 1965. The monsoon had failed, the treasury was empty, foreign exchange reserves had collapsed, and international creditors said, devalue or we will not lend you the money to survive. This was India's first lesson in the brutality of the global monetary order. Your sovereignty ends where your reserves run out. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi called the devaluation painful but necessary. The Indian public called it a national humiliation. Both were right. 25 years later, history repeated, but this time it was worse. India's foreign exchange reserves had fallen so low they could cover just 2 weeks of imports. The country was hours away from defaulting on its sovereign debt. The government of P.Y. Narasimha Rao did something that would be printed in textbooks for a century. They physically flew 67 tons of India's gold to the Bank of England and 47 tons to the Union Bank of Switzerland as collateral to borrow $2.2 billion. India pledged its gold, its most sacred asset, the gold of the people, to avoid bankruptcy. Within days, the IMF agreed to a bailout. The condition: India must liberalize, open its economy, remove trade restrictions, allow foreign investment, and the rupee was devalued in 2 steps over 2 days by 22%. This was the birth of modern India's economy. It was also the moment the rupee's slide accelerated from 17 rupees and 50 paise to the US dollar in 1990 to 31 rupees by 1993. Liberalization opened India to the world, but the world's capital flows do not respect sentiment, they respect fundamentals, and India's fundamentals would take decades to strengthen. On May 22, 2013, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke said 5 words that moved every emerging market currency on earth: a step down in pace. He meant the US is slowing its money printing. Markets heard, run now. Foreign institutional investors pulled $12 billion out of India in a matter of weeks. The rupee fell from 54 rupees to 68 rupees in months, a 25% collapse in the space of a summer. India's current account deficit at the time was 4.8% of GDP, the worst in recorded history. The country had been placed on the IMF's infamous Fragile Five list, along with Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, and South Africa. The RBI governor at the time, Duvri Subrao, said the currency was in a free fall. This was a critical lesson. India's rupee is not primarily controlled by India. It is controlled by what the Federal Reserve does in Washington, D.C. Every time the United States raises its interest rates, capital leaves emerging markets, and when capital leaves India, the rupee falls. This is the most important hidden fact in this entire documentary. From 2022 to 2025, three forces converged simultaneously. 1. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates from near zero to 5.25%. the fastest rate hike cycle in 40 years. Every 25 basis points the Fed hikes equals capital flows to the US dollar. 2. Foreign portfolio investors FPEs withdrew over 1.48 lakh crore rupees from Indian markets in 2025 alone. That is roughly 17 to 18 billion dollars, leaving India in a single year. 3. Donald Trump imposed 50% tariffs on Indian exports to the US. India's merchandise exports dropped 11.8% in October 2025. Its trade deficit hit a record 41.7 billion rupees in the same month. The result, in 2025, the Indian rupee fell 5.5% against the dollar, making it the worst performing currency in Asia. This is where we stand today, and the question is, where do we go from here? Ask most people why the rupee is falling, and they will tell you inflation, trade deficit, oil prices. They are not wrong, but they are only scratching the surface. The real story of the rupee's weakness is a story of 8 structural fault lines, buried so deep in the Indian economy that they have persisted across governments, ideologies, and decades of reform. These are not problems that can be fixed in one budget speech. They are the hidden architecture of rupee weakness. Let's examine each one. Fault line 1. The perpetual trade deficit. India has run a trade deficit where imports exceed exports for virtually every single year since independence. In simple terms, India consistently pays more to the world than the world pays to India. When you import more than you export, you need foreign currency to pay for those imports. More demand for dollars, less supply of dollars. The rupee falls. The trade deficit hit a record 41.7 billion rupees in a single month in 2025. That is not a crisis, that is a structural condition. India's top imports by value: crude oil, 85% of India's oil is imported. Electronics, India assembles but rarely manufactures semiconductors. Gold, Indians buy 800 to 900 tons of gold per year. Machinery and defense equipment, heavily import dependent. None of these will change quickly. The trade deficit is structural, not cyclical. Fault line 2. The oil dependency trap. India imports 85% of its crude oil. Every single barrel is priced in US dollars. This creates a brutal feedback loop that policymakers call the oil rupee doom cycle. Step 1. Global oil prices rise. Step 2. India's import bill expands. More dollars needed, rupee falls. Step 3. Cheaper rupee makes oil even more expensive in rupee terms. Step 4. Inflation rises, RBI tightens, growth slows. Step 5. Slower growth makes foreign investors nervous. FPI exits. Step 6. More rupee weakness. Oil bill rises further. Repeat indefinitely. This cycle has triggered every major depreciation episode since 1973. The 1973 oil shock, the 1979 oil shock, the 1990 Gulf War, the 2018 oil spike, the 2022 Russia-Ukraine energy crisis. India does not control oil prices. India does not control the dollar price of oil. India is controlled by oil. Until India breaks this dependency through EVs, solar, nuclear, the rupee will remain permanently vulnerable to decisions made in Riyadh and Houston. Fault line 3. The inflation differential, the silent killer. This is the fault line that academics write papers about but television anchors almost never explain. It is called the purchasing power parity differential, and it is perhaps the most fundamental reason the rupee has fallen over 78 years. The logic is simple. If India's inflation rate is consistently higher than America's, then the rupee must depreciate against the dollar over time. Why? Because higher inflation means the rupee buys less over time. If a basket of goods costs 100 rupees in India and $1 in America in 2000, but Indian prices rise 5% per year while American prices rise 2%. By 2025, that same basket costs 338 rupees in India but only $1.64 in America. The exchange rate must adjust to reflect this reality. India's average CPI inflation over 25 years, 6.5 to 7% per year. US average inflation over the same period 2.5 to 3% per year. That differential, compounded over 25 years, mathematically explains most of the rupee's depreciation. This is not a policy failure, this is structural economics, and it will persist as long as India's inflation exceeds the US. Fault Line 4 FII/FPI outflows. The borrowed prosperity problem. Here is the most uncomfortable hidden fact in Indian finance. India's economy, despite its $3.9 trillion GDP, is significantly financed by foreign portfolio investors. Foreign institutional investors (FIIs) and foreign portfolio investors (FPIs) hold vast portions of India's stock market and bond market. When global conditions change, they leave instantly. No notice, no loyalty, no concern for India's economic health. In 2022, FP is pulled $17 billion out of India. Rupee fell to 82 rupees. In 2025, FP is pulled $17 to $18 billion again. Rupee fell to 90.43 rupees. Each time they exit, they convert rupees to dollars. That conversion floods the forex market with rupees. Supply of rupees surges, demand for rupees collapses, the rupee falls. This is the borrowed prosperity problem. India's market boom of the 2000s was partly real, partly borrowed capital that eventually demands repayment. The hidden fact: India cannot fully control its own currency as long as its market is as dependent on foreign portfolio flows as it currently is. Fault Line 5 The US Federal Reserve, India's invisible central bank. Perhaps the most sobering hidden fact: the most powerful force shaping the Indian rupee is not the Reserve Bank of India, it is the United States Federal Reserve, a body in which India has zero representation, zero vote, zero influence. Here is the mechanism. When the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates, US government bonds become more attractive. Global capital flows to the US dollar. Emerging market currencies, including the rupee, weaken. When the Fed cuts rates, capital flows back to emerging markets. The rupee temporarily strengthens. India's currency cycle is inverted to the Fed's policy cycle. This is a structural vulnerability that no amount of RBI intervention can permanently overcome. The Fed raised rates 11 times between March 2022 and July 2023. The rupee fell from 74 rupees to 83 rupees during the same period. Not coincidence, causation. The RBI spent $36 billion of India's precious forex reserves in the second half of 2024 alone just to slow this fall. Not stop it, just slow it. This is what currency sovereignty means in the 21st century. You can slow the fall, you cannot change its direction, not without fixing the fundamentals.